Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Labour Outlook Forum as part of Arise, an online festival of left ideas 2022. My name is Matthew Wilgrass. I'm editor of Labour Outlook and also one of the Arise volunteers, and I'm really delighted to join you to this discussion today. For those of you who've been tuning in regularly for the month, this is part of our Lefty Lunchtime series, and if you want to look at previous events in it, if you go to our YouTube channel, you can check them out there. In terms of the sort of usual housekeeping things, there are not many events left at Arise now. We finished with a big event with John McDonnell and a number of unions taking industrial action at the moment next Wednesday. So please check that out. And please also come to the other events on nuclear weapons, situation with Biden in the US, and in solidarity with Latin Americans left over the next 5 days. For our session today, we're delighted to have with us prominent socialist economist and author Michael Roberts, who also blogs at a site many of you would have seen, The Next Recession. And the topic of our discussion today is, can Marx's ideas help us understand the crisis? And obviously at the moment here in Britain and around the world, the economic crisis is deepening. And we're here today to argue and discuss if Marx's ideas can help us understand what is happening and what can be done about it. As some of you would have seen in the publicity, Nye Bevan once said that Marxism put into the hands of the working class movement the most complete blueprint for political action the world has ever seen. So in the British Labour movement, obviously Nye Bevan is someone who people talk to and refer to a lot. So it's interesting to see that he said that, and it's interesting to have this discussion today. In terms of the format of the meeting, Michael will do an introduction, and for those of you who want to, there is some graphs and other things you can download, which we put in the chat now on a PowerPoint on the YouTube chat, which you can download and will help you follow what he's saying. Then we've got plenty of time to put questions to him. So as well as telling us where you're from in the chat, it's always nice to see what CLP's, unions and other campaigns people are from and what areas. Also, please do think of your questions, as many as you want, and put them through, and we'll get as many through via myself to Michael as we can. And that's it for me, really. The only other thing is, please do make sure you follow Labour Outlook on social media and read it if you don't already. And if you can, please consider making a £10 donation at the link provided to the Arise Festival. Over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, for inviting me to Arise and Labour Outlook to discuss what I think is a most important session, because I think Marx has a great contribution to make to us, help us understand the key contradictions which exist in the 21st century in the major economies around the world. And these contradictions can be explained best by what Marx had to say. Yes, sometimes 150 years ago, it's still the case. I want to help describe what I want to argue here by sharing some slides with you on PowerPoint. I'm hoping you're going to be able to see that either in Zoom or and that you'll be able to follow that. I think you should be able to see me now. And so I'm going to go through a few slides with guys. Hopefully you can follow these on PowerPoint, or either in the chat, Zoom, or elsewhere if you're coming directly on the Zoom. So let me just share these things with you. So I'm hoping, guys, you can follow what I'm going to say on the graphs. Let me start by saying, what are the contradictions in modern capitalism, in modern society now in 2022? I think there are three great contradictions that we have to consider in the 21st century. First, the economic situation. We've got major recessions on a regular basis. There's a long depression been taking place over the last 10, 15 years with hardly any growth in investment, in wages, and so on. Increased poverty and inequality.
Hi, Michael. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt. As I said, and sorry to view as a tech person, it's off ill. I think people are going to have to open the link that we've just sent to them in the YouTube, and you're going to have to stop sharing your screen, because otherwise they can't see you on the YouTube.
Okay, let me just do that, and I'll just follow it some other way. That's no problem.
Sorry about that, and okay. Sorry everyone at home for the technical difficulties.
Yeah, so I hope you guys can see me now. Can you? Can you see me now, Matt? Has everybody
Yeah.
seen? Yeah. If so, I'll carry on. What do you think?
Yeah, I think we're ready now. Sorry, everyone.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. It's a little bit complicated with graphs, but let me just run through what I think are the main contradictions in the modern economy at the moment. There's the economic contradiction. We have massive regular crises, deep recessions. We've just been through in the 21st century a major, what was called the Great Recession in 2008-9, which took the world economies down. This is after a successive number of slumps before. We've just been through the COVID slump, we might call it that, the pandemic slump of 2020, which was just as deep and widespread as in 2008-9. We have generally poor growth, poor investment, no improvement in wages for large sections of the world's population. Of course, in the so-called global south, we have increased poverty and inequality across the world has expanded. Then there's the environmental contradiction, the tremendously dangerous situation of climate change and global warming. And now it appears the successive waves of different pandemics, pathogens hitting humanity across the globe and seriously damaging the health and killing millions, as in the case of COVID. And the general degradation of nature, which is taking place, the exploitation and destruction of the environment, of species, both in plant and in fauna. And the third key contradiction is the growing danger of war and of rivalry between major capitalist powers, imperialist powers, fighting over profits and control of trade and finance and resources around the world. In particular, the serious danger ahead of us of a confrontation between the United States and China. Now, in my view, all these contradictions, Marx would argue, can be related to the fundamental contradiction that exists under capitalism. That is, everything is being produced for the profit of a few, and the owners of the means of production, the land, the resources, the factories, companies around the world, everything is built around trying to increase their profits rather than being produced and developed for social need and society as a whole. That is the fundamental contradiction under capitalism. It's profit that drives capitalism. All previous modes of production and social formation after very primitive societies were based on an exploitation of humans and nature by others. So there's always been exploitation and class struggle for millennia. In slave society, it was done through the ownership of humans by other humans, like humans were owned like horses or any other animal. In feudal society, it was done through the control and ownership of the land and its produce and the commitment of others, serfs as they were called, to work that land for the lords and fight in wars for them. And in Asia, it was done through the control of the state and land and production to be controlled by absolute emperors across a wide range of regions and countries. But capitalism, this is the modern form of exploitation, is different. Here, it's through the exploitation of workers' labour power. No, most of us don't own anything in either land or any means of production. We have to work for a living. Only a small number of people own all the means of production, and they put us to work, and out of that work, they can sell goods and services which have a greater value than they pay us in wages. That's surplus value, as Marx called it. That was the great discovery he made about the capitalist form of exploitation, takes the form of profit, rent and interest in modern economies. So this is the fundamental contradiction that Marx brings to us to understand what is going on in the world as a whole. It's a battle between private profit and social need. The fundamental contradiction of capitalism, as Marx put it, I quote, incompatibility between the productive development of society and hitherto existing relations of production, expressing itself in bitter contradictions, crises, and spasms. It's the collision between production for profit on the one hand and the creation of wealth for the producers and their communities on the other. And he goes on to say that this system of capitalist exploitation can't last forever because it actually comes into its own contradiction. That's expressed in what Marx called the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Because at a certain point, the drive for profit comes into conflict with the development of the productivity of labour. And that causes constantly a series of crises and slumps in the economy. So capitalism never develops toward taking us all to a better life, more prosperous on a gradual and humane and harmonious basis. It does it through a series of spasms and slumps, which the majority of populations does not make any gain at all. So there are recurring crises on a regular basis under capitalism, since capitalism became the dominant mode of production in the world, which is probably about 200 years. We've had a succession of crises every 10 or so years, and sometimes much more severe in the depressions of the 1930s, for example, and I would argue now. So global growth, which is the basic criteria for the expansion of more resources for everybody to use, that has been slowing for decades amid regular slumps throughout the 20th century, and as I was arguing earlier, throughout the 21st century. At the same time, increasingly, the ownership of the means of production has gotten more concentrated and centralized in just a very small number of people. Back at the millennium, we used to talk about the 1% and the rest of us at 99%. I have to say that 1% is an exaggeration of how much of the resources of the world and the means of production are controlled. Is much less than 1% that control everything. The Swiss Federal Institute of Technology worked out recently that there's just 147 companies throughout the world through interlocking states that control 40% of all the companies in the world. And about 700 companies control 80% of the others. So this is an extreme concentration of power of capital, which now exists in the 21st century. And if you look at personal wealth, it's estimated by the Credit Suisse Corporation in their research that 1% of the world's population, adults, own 50% of all the personal wealth in the whole world. That 1% is just a very small number of people, just 33 million out of 7.9 billion people, including children, but if you exclude them, something like 5 or 6 billion people in the world who are adults, and only 33 million control 50% of all the wealth. Now, this may surprise you, but those of you who are watching this YouTube now and this presentation may not realize that the majority of you, if not all of you, are in the top 10% of the world's wealth holders. You're up the top of a pyramid, which is very increasingly narrow. How is that possible? How can you say, because I don't really own much at all? Yes, but 3.5 to 4 billion people know absolutely no wealth at all. They have nothing, just what they can survive on a day-to-day basis. That's how extreme the concentration of wealth and income is in the world today. And that's the point that Marx brings home to us, that this capitalist system is not one of equality and of fair play in free markets. It's one of extreme inequality and of exploitation by a very small number of people over the rest of us. There are now approximately over 4 billion people living in poverty. How do we define that? Well, the World Bank defines that, can you believe it, at anybody who earns less than $2 a day, $2 a day. Even if you take it up to $5 a day, which even then is a very low figure, we have around about 4 billion people, adults and children, living in poverty today. That's an increase of 1 billion in absolute numbers over the last 3 decades. So more people are becoming poor as we go through in the 21st century. Another prediction that Marx have made, that increasingly there'll be a very small number of people controlling all the wealth and an increasing number of people in near poverty or in without really any wealth at all. And a recent Oxfam report found that billionaires during COVID period have seen their fortunes increase as much as in the last 2 years as they did in the last 23 years. Billionaires in the food and energy sectors, where prices have rocketed recently, have massively increased. Every 2 days, billionaires in those areas have an increase in their wealth of $1 billion every 2 days. And that we find that there are now 62 new billionaires based on food production during the COVID period. So this means at the same time it took on average to create a new billionaire during the pandemic, 1 million people have been pushed into extreme poverty during that period. That's the situation where increasingly capitalism is profiting from the pain of others. And that's, again, what Marx explains. if you read his books, particularly Capital, in the chapters which deal with the conditions that people work under and their relationship with their bosses, which is what he does. It's not all weird economics. It's also basic stuff about what's going on in the factory and so on. Nothing has changed in 150 years. Increasingly, capitalism drives forward to try and introduce machinery to replace jobs, because they hope this will increase the profitability and productivity of labour. But in so doing, of course, they drive down labour's share of the total income in an economy. And what we've seen is a sharp fall in labour's share in all the major economies over the last 30 or 40 years out of the total production taking place. The profit share is increasing, labour's share is falling. Exactly what Marx wants to bring home to you as being the nature of this capitalist system. So in the future, we're going to be faced with the question of a situation where increasingly machineries replace our jobs. The question is, who's going to control and own those machines? Is it going to be a small group of people, this less than 1%? Or are we going to socialise the ownership of machinery and production for the benefit of society as a whole? Then there's the environmental contradiction. The climate disaster is a threat to every human being on the planet now. Of course, much more a threat to the poor in the global south, but also to us in the more difficult areas of the world where global warming is going to cause massive droughts, floods, and millions will be forced probably over the next 20 years to consider immigration because where they live is becoming uninhabitable. The climate disaster is expressed in the sharp increase in temperature we're seeing globally. We've seen a 1% increase since industrial times, since the beginning of the industry now, in the average global temperatures. That dramatically changes the environment as we know. But the prediction is that by the end of this half century, by 2050, that will be more closer to 2% increase. Is there anything being done about it? Well, the answer is, despite all the talk, despite all the promises, big business, the governments of the world, the fossil fuel industries are doing nothing to stop this climate disaster. No attempt is really being made to curb fossil fuel production, replace it with renewables sufficiently to close down these industries which are just emitting all this carbon and other greenhouse gases. Instead, for the sake of profit, the process continues towards this climate disaster over the next 20 years, and it's accelerating. Every day we can see what scientists expected in terms of increased heat waves, droughts and floods are coming much quicker than they expected. The situation is deteriorating fast and the time is running out for us to save the planet in its conditions. One of the reasons is, of course, that capitalism is much more interested in making profit and to continue its control of the world than it is in controlling climate change and global warming. One of the striking features is that the sector of the economy which emits more carbon dioxide than any other sector of the economy and more than many other nations is the US military machine. Because it is so large, it consumes huge amounts of energy and fossil fuels and therefore emits on its basis huge amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. So that war and climate change are integrally connected, and that is something which we cannot ignore, the connections between the two. Now you might say, is Marx relevant to that? Well, if you read a lot of Marx's writings back in the past, and Engels, he demonstrates the dangerous environmental degradation that takes place with the rapacious development of capitalism for profit by spreading its tentacles throughout the world into the more remote forests and other areas, the destruction of timber, the mining of minerals, and of course, as we know in the case of fossil fuels, the huge expansion in order to raise energy and produce more profit for the energy companies. He explains that in many parts of the book. So when people say Marx and Engels only talk about crises and growth, that's not true. They also talk about the impact of environmental degradation as a result of capitalism. And one of the things that comes out of that, of course, that we've seen in the COVID pandemic, this spread of capitalism to the more remote areas of the world has meant that we've humanity has come into contact through industrial farming, through mining, through urbanization with wildlife in the remote parts of the world that contain many dangerous pathogens to humanity, which have now made contact with humanity through farm animals, industrial farming, and other ways, and have led to a series of epidemics and now pandemics. COVID-19 is just one. There have been some before already of dangerous viruses that have come through, and we have more coming. There are more pandemics to come as a result of the inability of capitalism to control environmentally its expansion, and therefore leave us open to these dangers, and also not to develop the health systems we needed and the equipment that's needed to protect us from these dangerous pathogens. One of the things that came out of COVID, I have to remind you, is that before COVID, there were 22 pharmaceutical companies in the US. Nearly all of them did no research whatsoever into vaccines that could come from dangerous pathogens. They were much more interested in producing drugs for obesity, for depression, for things of this sort, which are much more profitable. No vaccination research was done. Inevitably, under the pressure of the COVID situation and huge government spending, the pharmaceutical companies directed their technology into producing these vaccinations very quickly. It demonstrates that if we get away from a profit system in pharmaceuticals to a system that meets social needs, we have the resources, we have the technology to do it, to help humanity and the nature. But normally, that is not the situation under capitalism. The other big contradiction is what I call the geopolitical conflict, which Marx has described and others who are after him that have developed under capitalism. It's huge rivalry. It's not just the exploitation of workers by capitalists, but also the huge rivalry between capitalists to control the resources of the world based on their own national states, nation states, wherever they're based. So we have a struggle between different capitalist countries, which have different capitalist companies in them, looking to control the surplus value created by the world. This is particularly expressed in the fact that there's a huge transfer of surplus value from the global south, the workers of the global south and the peasants of the global south, through their domestic companies and also through foreign companies, back into the so-called global north, the imperialist bloc of just about 10 or a dozen major countries, where all the major capitalist companies and big companies are in, and where the finances of the world and the trade of the world is controlled. So there's a continual transfer of surplus value to these countries, but also a battle between these countries to control the resources and the profits of the world. And that leads, going back 100 years now, as Lenin explained, that imperialism, as it was called, leads to the dangers of war, rivalry between different capitalist powers, imperialist powers over control, or by the imperialist bloc trying to impose its will upon other countries that resist that. So we see increasingly the dangers of war in the 21st century, starting with Afghanistan and Iraq, and now we have the situation with Ukraine and Russia, where we have a war that looks like being endless and destroying the whole country of Ukraine. It's killing many thousands and destroying the very structures of the economy as a battle takes place between the imperialist powers and the Ukrainian government against Putin and his capitalist regime in Russia. This is a product. This can be explained not by evil people, evil Putin, whatever. It can be explained by the struggle between various imperialist and capitalist powers to control the resources, in this case of Ukraine and of other countries along that border, and to control and increase the profits. Marx is explaining then that's what causes wars. It's capitalism and imperialism. It's not caused just by individuals being bad or having making mistakes or whatever. And if we consider that fact, we know that there's just about 10 or a dozen major economies in the world that have, and yet in various alliances amongst themselves, that try to control all the world's resources. The US, Europe, major European Union powers, Japan, and that's about it. The rest of the world has nothing really in terms of control of the share of its national output in the world, the share of investment in the world, its financial position, its military power. The US's military power, their spending is more than the rest of the world put together in terms of military spending. So it's not just the concentration of capital in terms of companies, of technology and finance, but it's also concentration of military power. That is the situation as we enter the 21st century. That is something that Marx and Engels tried to explain, and writers after them was going to develop under capitalism. Now, I just want to finish by saying that's capitalism. What's the alternative? What can we consider as the alternative? Ending capitalist rule. And Marx said the first condition of the transition to what you call communism, a society where people are working for social need, not for private profit, is through the liberation of the working class through a democratic revolution and the removal of capitalist rule. State control of the banks and communications, public ownership of the key means of production, progressive taxation, so all these tax havens which the rich have at the moment are removed to end much of the existing inequality, an expansion of public works and services rather than private production, and the levelling up of incomes geographically. Free education, health, communications, transport. These things, which you even a few decades ago, perhaps the last ones were considered gains that have been made by the working class, are now increasingly under threat. Socialism means fundamentally to me, and I think to Marx, a classless society where common ownership ends private property, where there's no state, national or otherwise, no state oppression through armies. Instead, people work harmoniously together to develop the world economy and its resources. No oppression of women, no oppression of nations, races, and creeds. Ending nationalism, ending private property restores human freedom as social freedom. That's what we need to be working for as socialists. And also, socialism means saving the planet, a common and all-embracing, far-sighted control of the production of raw materials requires the control of associated producers, said Marx. So in other words, control of the raw materials of the world, nature, requires common ownership and associated producers, not production for profit. We need to have not just unity of man with man, to use Marx's phrase, but unity of man with nature. Only a society which makes possible the harmonious cooperation of its productive forces on the basis of one single vast plan can allow industry to settle on whatever form of distribution of the whole planet is best adapted to the development and maintenance of elements of production, i.e., that is nature. Freedom consists in the control of ourselves and over external nature. I'll just finish on a couple of other people, not Marx, who also take a similar view. Albert Einstein said, "I'm convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy accompanied by an education system that will be oriented towards social goals. The real purpose is precisely to overcome and advance beyond the predatory phase of human development towards socialism." And perhaps I could mention Oscar Wilde, who said that with the abolition of private property, then we shall have true, beautiful, and healthy individuals. Nobody will waste his life in accumulating things and the symbols of things. One will live. Most people exist. That is all. And Marx sums it up by saying, an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And the happiness of the individual is inseparable from the happiness of Marx.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone tuning in on YouTube, and apology for the various technical difficulties we had there at the start. This shows you all that this is very much a volunteer operation. So thanks for your patience. I thought that was really excellent from Michael. The first question we had...
The sound wasn't very good, guys, but I hope we'll pick it up in the questions and answers.
I think it improved, it stabilized as it went on, and we've got the captions on as well. The The first question I was going to ask you was about what policies we should advocate a Labour or similar governments abroad to do at the moment, but I think you've kind of answered that in the second last bit of your presentation. So I'm going to move on to the next one, which is about the Tory leadership election, which is going on at the moment.
And brass tacks, yeah.
And specifically that Rishi Sunak said today that he was like a conventional Thatcherite or something similar, or common sense Thatcherite, I think was his exact wording. And something that our questioner wants to know is, did Thatcherism sort of diversify the economy and lead to a boost in the middle class, as it's called, as Sunak and others claim? Or is that a myth? Like, is it the same? Thatcherism continued the same trends that you were speaking about, monopolisation and so on in your presentation. So I think we'll take that one first because it's quite a specific question.
Well, Matt, and your question, it's a total myth, isn't it? Let's take one of the things that Thatcher's supposedly famous for, which is the right to buy. The council houses would be sold off to the tenants so that they've had the private home ownership instead of state housing for rent. A lot of those houses were sold off and flats were sold off at a huge discount, reducing the council stock dramatically. What happened to the people who bought those houses? Many of them sold them on to property companies. And do you know that of 1/3 of all the houses and flats sold at a discount by Thatcher, under Thatcher's government, ended up now in huge property companies, and they are now operating at extremely high rents to be charged for those properties. The result has been actually a concentration of the ownership of housing in a very small group of companies, and the ending of social housing as we understood it back in the 50s and 60s, and with the development of council house building. No council houses at all really are being built anymore, except for a very small specific number of people. On the whole, the housing situation is an absolute disaster. It's highly concentrated between those people who have managed, perhaps like me, to be on the home ownership ladder, even if it's with a mortgage, and the vast majority of people with no home ownership paying huge rents either in the private sector or whatever they can do in social housing that's possible. That's a disaster. How can that be a development of the middle class? In no way is it development of the middle class. And that applies across the board when we look at all the other things. Small businesses have not thrived, did not thrive under Thatcher. It's not true. If we look at the evidence, the inequalities of wealth and income increased sharply under Thatcher, not just the difference between the wages of the top and the bottom, between the huge incomes which the chief executives earn and the workers that they work for at the bottom, but also in wealth, as I pointed out. It's not just global wealth, but in Britain, the inequality of wealth under Thatcher was spectacularly increased. It actually only started to level off in the late 1990s under the Blair government, because there was an expansion of education and health spending at that time, for at least for a while. But under the Thatcher period, which I remind the questioners from 1979 to 1990, just over a decade, it was a complete disaster in terms of improving the situation of so-called middle class, and for that matter, of course, for working people. The inequalities increased, the collapse of public services, they were destroyed in that period, privatized, outsourced, handed back. Think of all the industries that before Thatcher came into the office that were publicly owned, in particular the utilities, energy, water, communications. BT used to be publicly owned. All these things are ended up in the private sector for huge profits to be made for the dividends of those shareholders. While we know what energy prices are like today, we know how the water companies are polluting the rivers and the seas and being fined minimally for doing so. And we know that when we had a Corbyn leadership, we were planning to have free broadband for everybody, which BT could have provided. A publicly owned communications and broadband system would have been perfectly possible if we maintained those things as part of social ownership. So it's a total myth that in any way Thatcher improved. So how come Thatcher won elections? Well, that's a different story. We could go into that about why they won elections. But on the economic front, there is no argument to say that Thatcher improved a lot for the majority of the population, and particularly neither did it improve a lot for the middle class, so-called middle class. That's people presumably who are not manual workers, who have got professional jobs and so on. They didn't make much of an improvement, and certainly inequalities between the very top and the very bottom expanded greatly.
Thanks, Mike. I'm just looking at the chat here on YouTube. First of all, nice to have people from all around the world with us. So welcome Mary in California, and welcome JA in South Australia, who seems to say that a similar thing has happened in Australia with council houses now being sold off for large amounts of money to private properties. Also, some great comments. Thank you, MD, for your comment about the need to take social care into public ownership, and to Johnny about wealth taxes. Got quite an interesting question here, which is sort of something that I think Michael probably would have dealt with before. What would you say as a socialist economist to critics who say Marxism is obsolete because they didn't foresee the advent of how different technologies and waves of technologies would improve the economy? So I guess recently we're talking about the revolution, internet, things like that. I guess automation before that. That's quite an interesting question. Let's take that one next.
Yeah, well, so we've had a number of innovations. We're always getting innovations, and because capitalism is looking for ways to improve the level of labour productivity for profit, not for the benefit of society as a whole. So it's considering a lot of new innovations it can introduce if it makes it profitable. I would remind you that capitalism also suppresses many innovations if it doesn't like them and they're not going to be profitable, or they can only be done on a social basis. But many of the things mentioned, like the internet, broadband, various other technologies, were actually first funded by public sector and state funds. Microsoft, Facebook, all those ideas which you see in the social media, now they're big private companies, but the original software, the original ideas actually came from the development of research in the public sector, quite often in the military, actually. In the case of the internet, the World Wide Web was a public-funded innovation, discovery by a scientist, and then became privatized and developed for the benefit of profit, and of course for social expansion as well. So the idea that innovation has proven that capitalism works is an illusion, really. And in fact, I have to say, if we look at the evidence of the last 25 years, the productivity and innovation development is really weak. Innovation expansion, which can be measured by economists, they do it, is slowed down dramatically. There is no real improvements taking place. Capitalism is struggling on to develop what Marx would call the productive forces, in other words, the improvement of the production powers that we've got to help everybody. It's slowing down dramatically. We're in a period where investment in things that we need and could use is slowing. The new ideas are not being developed properly because there's no profitability in it, so they just sit there. And now we don't have the position where the state is really funding many of these innovations, so we can't see any progress as well. So there is no evidence that capitalism is now taking the world economy forward and improving our conditions at any rate. I usually get the argument, finish on this map, usually get the argument, well, what about life expectancy? Life expectancy in the last 100 years has rocketed. So, you know, countries like India's life expectancy is up, China's up hugely. Everywhere life expectancy is up. People are living longer. People are not dying so much. So capitalism's saving, it's working, isn't it? Well, the first answer to say to that is that that's down to state-funded medical help and also down to public services like irrigation, sewage, clean water. All these things are not done by capitalists on the whole. They're done by state organizations and infrastructure. Those are the keys to increased life expectancy. Improved nutrition has come about through the expansion of new technologies in these areas. But one of the biggest reasons for a rise in life expectancy is in economies where planning has been operated, where the state plays a major role, like China. I mean, China has taken 850 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years, just in the last 30 years. That's a staggering effect due to a state-dominated economy with a plan which aims at a lot of social objectives rather than trying to make profits for a small number of companies. So where progress has been made, it's often been made in spite of the private sector and the capitalist sector rather than because of it.
I think that's a really interesting point, and something else bearing in mind, you touched on Eastern Europe earlier, and of course when sort of neoliberal capitalism, if you could even call it that, was restored in Eastern Europe in the 90s, life expectancy fell dramatically in some countries, and especially the poorer countries in that region, and Russia itself, which is kind of a good reverse example of your last point.
Russia's life expectancy under the new capitalist regimes and under Putin dropped dramatically. And the same, as you say, in various Eastern European countries like Ukraine, which also took a punishing fall. And people left these countries too. I mean, Lithuania, Estonia, these countries have had a massive emigration into the West as the only way to find new prosperity.
And this sort of links a bit to our next question, which has come in on Facebook. And thank you to people watching on Facebook, which is, could we argue that Marx was essentially correct in his analysis of the economy and what would happen, but that he and Engels and others were wrong in their predictions that the working class and others would rise up to change the system? I think that's a bit of a shorter way of putting it than the question is there, but I think I get the gist.
Yes, so I think the question is pointed here is that, okay, so Marx and Engels might be able to prove or show that their predictions for growing inequality, crises, and so on, and all the contradictions that I mentioned might be correct and can be explained by the capitalist drive for profit and its and the nature of the capitalist mode of production. But in that case, why hasn't the working class overthrown this system? Well, that's a bigger political question, which takes another discussion. All I would say is that I think any person watching this on YouTube now knows that there are a lot of things that working people have to get on in lives, and that is just living. To use Oscar Wilde's phrase, most of us just exist rather than actually develop our skills and creative, or have any time to do these things, especially if you have families or whatever, or if you're old or you're firm. There's all kinds of reasons why people find difficulty in taking things forward. That's one thing. They don't have a lot of time. The other thing is that they have to know how to do this. What's the alternative? So capitalism's rotten, but what's the alternative? It's not clear what the alternative is. Does it just mean we need a bit more tax? Do we just need to fight for a bit more wages? Do we need to have to stop our schools being closed? Yes, but that's not going to change the fundamental structure of the system. That's going to stop some of the worst things happening. But how can we change it fundamentally? It's not very clear to everybody, A, what the alternative is, which we've just been discussing on this session, and B, whether we've got the time and the organization to achieve that. And think about it, organizing is not easy. It takes a lot of, take the strikes taking place in Britain now. That's not easy to organize. As the head of ASLEF said, we don't strike very often. We don't want to strike. It's difficult to organize a strike. We lose money. Yes, passengers and others lose time, but we lose money too. So it's a big decision to go on strike in order to try and improve your conditions. So there has to be a level of confidence to do that. And just think about it, question everybody. To change the whole of society doesn't come up very often. If we look at the history of capitalism over the last 200 years, yes, there have been revolutionary moments. By that I mean when enough people wanted to change the whole system and go to something else that they thought would be better over the last 200 years. That's happened on several occasions in different parts of the world, but not very often. I prefer to look at it this way. Revolutions are very, very rare, but when they happen, they really do change things. So it's a big impact. So it's not going to just happen because we think it's right. It takes a lot of other conditions that have to come together. Confidence, organization, economic position for a sufficient number of workers, good leaders. Are we not sitting here to discuss this so we can understand better how we can participate and develop in the movement? a way forward. That's the point of these discussions, so that we understand better what to do, and that the opportunity arises, we can do it. So all these things have to come together if we want to change it.
Thanks, Michael. I've got a lot of questions and comments coming in. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you one specific question that's come in. Then I'm going to try and sum up the others in one sort of larger question. It can also be your summing up. Just before I do that as well, just a quick plug for Monday's session at Arise Festival, which is taking place in the evening on the Latin America's Left Leads the Way. And we've got speakers from Honduras, Bolivia, Colombia, Brazil, all these places where real risings against neoliberalism have taken place in recent years. And I hope people will join us at that. And also for our closing session next Wednesday, where we've got speakers from the NEU, PCS, FBU, Unison, RMT, all these unions moving into action along John McDonnell hosting them for that closing event for Arise. So please also come to that. The specific question we've had came in during the bit where you were talking about imperialism and divisions in the world economy. And it's something I think is quite interesting in light of what's going on in Sri Lanka, which is why I've picked it out, which is what is the role of debt, IMF and other debts in the developing world, or so-called third world, in terms of the Marxist analysis of imperialism?
Yeah, well, it's a very important area, the question of debt. On my blog, Michael Rock's blog, that I've done a lot of posts on the question of debt. Some people say, well, Marx doesn't talk about debt, so how is that relevant? Well, he does and he doesn't. Of course, he does. In the volume 3 of Capital, which I'm sure you've all read, he discusses the question of how credit develops and what its role is in capitalist system. But the main point to make here is that, as I pointed out, imperialism is extracting huge amounts of surplus value. But what I mean by imperialism is the companies in the imperialist countries are, by setting up operations in the global south and using global south workers, and in working with local companies as well, extracting huge amounts of surplus value and profit, income, rent, interest back into the imperialist countries through their own companies. That extraction means that those countries have less resources, less funds to develop their own economies. And as a result, they tend to borrow in order to try and improve their conditions. Who are they borrowing from? They're borrowing from the big banks in the West and the global North, and from the international agencies, and they all have conditions and they all want their pound of flesh. And as they increase their amount of debt in order to compensate for their loss of profit going abroad from the imperialist extraction, then they get more and more into difficulties, particularly if they cannot expand their economy sufficiently to cope in servicing that debt. And in the immediate position, there's been lots of debt crises, but in the immediate position after COVID, that's got way worse. Food prices have rocketed, energy prices have rocketed. Many of these countries have to import food and energy. They already got high debts. Interest rates are now beginning to rise, so they're going to have to pay more for the debts they've been borrowing. All those factors are driving lots of countries, particularly the poorest ones, the smaller ones, straight into what is called bankruptcy, if you like, or the bust of debt, which they can't pay. They're going to default, is the technical term, on their debt. And that means that they will be unable to sustain even the existing position they've got now. Sri Lanka is a very extreme example of what is happening to other countries already. In Sri Lanka, which is not very big, it's an island of 22 million people, it's built up a load of debt. Much of that debt was handled by a bunch of corrupt political leaders under one family who socketed it all away either on stupid schemes of building towers or into their yachts and God knows where else, and not in the development of the economy. So they've now run out of the ability to raise any more debt. Food, they're now, loads of people without food. Energy is stopped, you can't get around the country, there's no fuel. As a result, people have revolted. They've thrown the president out. The parliament has just re-elected another corrupt person to take over as president. We'll see where that develops. But that's the extreme position of the debt crisis. Where does it come from? Originally, it starts because of the increased difficulty of these very poor countries to have enough profits in the capitalist system. And what they are getting is extracted by the imperialist ones. So it's a product of imperialism and capitalism in their own countries. And that has led to the huge expansion of debt. for a whole range of countries across the world. It's going to get worse as a result of COVID and the food crisis. Expect more of this.
Thank you, Mike. I'm glad someone asked that question. I think it's important that we discuss economics in a global sense, not just what's going on here, as awful as the cost of living crisis is. We're into the sort of last 10 minutes. Before I ask this question, I'm going to do a little plug. As people know, this forum, particular forum at Arise, is hosted by Labour Outlook. Labour Outlook is a daily web publication that has regular columns from various left union leaders and campaign group MPs. And I think we've had this the best read and shared website now on Labour's left. You can now become a Patreon of Labour Outlook, which means you join its community for a fee of less than £10 a month, and you get access to some additional content and also help run the website and its social media. So please, that link will be following up in the chat, and please do consider doing that. It really will make a big difference to the publication. The questions that we've got left are all more about the situation here and about struggle. So we've got different ones from Jeff asking about trade unions' role in the struggle and the limitations of that, obviously referencing the strikes that you mentioned at RMT and others. Same comrade also asking about, is the Labour Party, this is a question, of course, that we come to on nearly all these forums, is the Labour Party enough, or is the Labour Party an actual instrument of social change, which I think we could probably have a whole forum on that ourselves. And then people sort of also asking about what happened to Occupy and the kind of, which you'd call early anti-capitalist movements about 10 years ago, give or take. So I'm not going to expect you to come back on all those points, but maybe if it's summing up, if you sum up what you think the key points are, but also maybe some of the way forward for us here. And then I'll make a couple of housekeepings and then we'll shut off then.
Well, I think they're good questions. You can link them together because, I mean, clearly at the basic level of class struggle for working people is to maintain or sustain, or at least try to improve their living standards and or at least sustain what they are, starts in the workplace. Therefore, it means it starts by organizing in the workplace to try and preserve wages and conditions or improve them, particularly when the situation with prices outside are rising fast and so on. So it's the basic thing, isn't it? That if we're in the workplace, we need to organize together, and that means the development of trade unions. Trade unions have been dramatically weakened, not only in the UK, but in all the major economies over the last 30 or 40 years, from when maybe 50 or 60% of workplaces were unionized. Now it's less than 15% in most countries, or even lower, and mainly in the public sector. So unions have been drastically reduced. What has happened? That's meant the increase in inequality of income between the rich and the poor. We can measure it exactly as economists. The correlation is very good with the decline of union density and the decline of labour's share in income. So the first thing is to say that unions are important. It's our basic level of struggle. But as the questioner hints at, that is obviously not going to be enough. Unions struggling for decent wages and conditions in their workplace can only go so far there. We need, there's a whole political movement of development of a campaign to improve our social services, our public services, protect them and expand them. And also a political campaign to move to change the nature of the capitalist system, whether it's an improved wealth tax or wealth tax of some sort, or in my case, public ownership of the key sectors of the economy, including banks. And I remind people that every time there's a public opinion poll on the issue of renationalisation of the railways, or the water utilities and the energy utilities, or public ownership of broadcasting and broadband, and public ownership of banks, there is a majority of the British population asked who are in favour of that, and that includes conservative voters. The fact is that no political leadership is prepared to adopt it and carry it out. That's the issue that we face. So then it becomes a political campaign. So it's not enough just to have unions. I would say on Occupy Now, that was a movement of youth, mainly, protest against climate change, against the inequalities in the world, the 1% against the 99%. But it lacked a class cohesion. It lacked organised class cohesion, which first of all unions can give, but also political organisations that have a base in the wider public and amongst the working class that can give us an organisation to change things. Is Labour enough? Well, Labour is historically been connected in the UK to the trade unions. The two things are connected together. Labour was set up to do the political campaigning that unions could not do. That was the point of Labour. Therefore, it seems to me, as far as we're concerned, and I've been a Labour Party member for over 50 years, it is a question of trying to get Labour to play the role that it should play, which is to represent working people in political struggle in Parliament, but also outside Parliament, to bring about the change in society. Now, whether this Labour leadership or any leadership is going to appear to achieve that over the rest of my life and your life remains to be seen, but that is our task.
Thank you, Michael. I thought that's a really good way of putting it. I certainly couldn't put it any better myself. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We've had great numbers on this call, which I think is interesting and shows that people want to discuss in-depth socialist ideas as well as some of the more rally type events we're hosting. So thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to our volunteer Fraser as well. Apologies again for the technical difficulties. As I said, our tech volunteer is currently off ill, so I'm trying my best to do it, but it was certainly a challenge, but I think we got there in the end. Up next at Arise Festival, people interested, this Sunday, we have Nina Turner and David Sirota leading a panel on the US Biden. How is the lesser evil going? I suspect their answer might be not too good, but tune in on Sunday to find out, and thank you everyone for joining us.
And thank you everyone. Sorry about the technical things.
And also just to say, we will send a PowerPoint to everyone who registered as well. Thank you.